policy that we would have in place for a long time. I think in practice, it wouldn't have that much impact because people generally aren't running for more than 2 terms if that was the limit. So I don't think it's necessarily a major question. I think if the public really has a problem with James Lee being in a 3rd term, they have an option. There was an option for people to run against him as Democrats. There's now a choice for voters between him and Republicans, and ultimately it'll be probably one Republican that's running against him in the fall. And so there is a choice there. And so I think it's an important discussion to have. I don't have hard and fast views either way on it. I do, because people ask me about this related to the legislature a lot of the time, and I do actually have some strong views on it related to the legislature, because first of all, we have an incredible, because of the way the legislature is set up in the state of Washington, where you have to physically be there for several months of the year, but you really have to have another job back home the rest of the time, which is quite difficult to sort of juggle a life that way. And because the pay really for most people will require them to have outside employment as well. There is very high turnover in the legislature. So you do have a few people that stay a long time, but generally there's high turnover because of these other factors. And one of the things I worry about in a legislative session, legislative setting, and it'd be same in Congress. So I get frustrated with the people staying like 30 years in Congress. That doesn't happen for the reasons I said in Olympia. But one of the downsides is if the legislators rotate out after, say, 6 years or whatever it is, you have less institutional knowledge amongst legislators, and that then empowers the lobbyists and the staff. And I don't think that is always a good thing. The staff is incredible. The lobbyists, actually, most lobbyists bring a lot to the table by presenting information and different sides of different points of view on an issue. So I'm not saying they're bad in any way, but people want their elected officials to be the ones making the ultimate decisions. And it's harder if you always have to rely on staff. And it's the same issue we sometimes talk about. Should we be a full-time legislature? That would actually empower the legislators more and make us more expert, more in the weeds on the details, less reliant on the staff and the agencies for information. But there's a balance there. And so term limits, I think, would get us on the wrong side of that balance for the legislature.
All right, thank you. Our last forum guest was Chris Vance, the former chair of the Washington State Republican Party, former Washington State Senate candidate. And he recently, in an op-ed, said he thinks a 3rd party could be created in Washington from people with more centrist views. Do you believe that both political parties, the Democrats and Republicans, represent majority of people's views, political views in the state, or do you think there is room for a more centrist party? And how about Senator Short?
So I actually, number one, people can run as they choose under whichever label they choose. I think with the advent of changing to the top 2, it hurt 3rd-party candidates because generally, if the way it was before, you would have that 3rd-party candidate going through to the general election, and that doesn't happen now with the top 2. It's just top 2. So I think that is an unintended consequence of being hurtful to people running who aren't aligned, or they don't see themselves as being a Republican or a Democrat. But honestly, I think if you look at the issues that we deal with on a daily basis, whether we're in session or without, 147 people in the legislature, and the governor, there's a lot of room to make sure that people are represented. Whatever the issues are, whether it's, education, or it's race, or it's social services, or it's natural resources, water policy, just general budgets and the structure of budgets. we hear, I've only served on one budget committee that was in the House, and it was a subcommittee, but you hear a lot from a lot of different people when you serve on a budget committee. And so I would argue that we do represent, and I don't understand Chris's view to say that there isn't centrist representation, because again, if you're doing the give and take of your policies, there are over usually a session 2,000 to 3,000 bills with all different kinds of ideas. Now, granted, not a small percentage of those get through the process, but through amendments, through committees, through work sessions, there's so many different ways that we can get people's points of view into the process. And so I think that process exists today. But with the change in the two-party system to the top two, I think it is definitely hurt. It's hurt different party candidates for sure.
Thanks. And I think Chris's main problem, or the reason why he thinks that's needed, is because of the Democratic dominance, particularly on the west side of the state. He thinks that having a more centrist candidate might attract people from both parties. So, Senator Billig, your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I think I think about it on individual bills or individual issues, and we do have centrists. When you look at an individual issue in the legislature, you're going to have those people in the middle, whether they be Republicans or Democrats, that those are on the big issues. I mean, a lot of the votes are 49-0, but on the big issues, you've got this group in the middle that are kind of the fulcrum point. And so we do have the centrists that are helping to make that final compromise, or the key people, the last two votes you have to convince, that you have to put an amendment in to get, that you have to water down the bill or strengthen the bill to get. And so on issues, the centrists do exist. I wouldn't have a problem with a third party. I think there's a lot to be said for the scenarios like what you see in Europe, and obviously it's a whole different system, but where you have almost coalitions that come together to make governments or to make individual policies. But I think it's a huge uphill battle. That's not how our state is designed. I think that we generally represent our districts well. When I look at how my district votes on initiatives or other polling that you see, it does feel like I'm reflective of that. I know Senator Short's a great reflection of her district, and so if we're not, we're going to lose, or at least be at a risk of losing an election. And I think so I think it's working from that way. And the last thing is, I think just overall the system's working. I mean, look at Washington State. We are a leading state in so many ways. We're number one in exports, international exports, and manufacturing for international exports. We have a great diversity of our economy, from technology to farming. We have a very well-educated, effective workforce. We have a great educational system. We have amazing parks. We're near the top in almost every policy area, and we're like middle of the road in taxes. We're, I think, 24th or 25th in overall state and local taxes in Washington State. So we're like, delivering high quality at a reasonable price. That's a really good value. And we've done it responsibly with the 4-year balanced budget, as Senator Short said, and with large reserves. Now, we're going to be in trouble here because the reserves aren't large enough, but they were larger than I think than almost every other state. I think the system's working, actually.
Okay, thanks for that.
Mark, if I could just add something to that.
Sure.
I would work. I mean, if other people are elected and there would be an issue, where a person of another party or another affiliation could come in. When we get to the legislature, it's not, oh, we're just working with Republicans, or, oh, we're just working with Democrats. You're really working with your colleagues, your legislative colleagues, to get things done. So I don't look at that. When I come home and I share with people, what we've done in the legislature, it's about working with individuals, not whether they're Democrats or Republicans.
Thank you. And Senator Billig, you brought up the fact that our revenues are taking a hit currently, and that's part of that is because of the COVID-19 response and the prevention measures that have been put in. Most of our revenues let me ask you a question. Do most of our revenues come from sales tax in this state?
Sales tax, B&O, property tax. Those are the three big ones.
Okay, so the sales tax revenue is definitely down because spending is down based on those factors. I'd just like your assessment, each of you, of our state's COVID-19 response. And given the fact that this is a long-term challenge for our state and our nation, what can we be doing to do better, to respond to it?
Sure.
Senator Short?
Would you like to start?
Go ahead, Senator Short.
Sure. So I have got to say that when we were in session, when the pandemic started really showing its head in Washington State, it was pretty daunting to be there. We knew we were all at risk. We had a job to do. And, clearly there was, unanimous support, I think, to take funds out of the rainy day fund to make sure that our state Department of Health had the money it needed to start off what has been a pretty long journey. I'm sure it's going to get longer yet. And we all very much supported the governor's, his initial stay home orders. They've been tough. Schools were impacted, all of those things, to really bend that curve to ensure that not everybody gets this virus at the same time in a way that would overwhelm the hospitals. I've got to say that I have grown increasingly concerned with how the goalposts keep getting moved. I want to make sure that our state can effectively respond. But clearly, what has been shown mostly is that, unfortunately, congregate settings, our long-term care facilities need more help from the state in order to be better prepared. We've seen, unfortunately, a large number of deaths of Washington State have occurred in that setting. Workplaces are becoming a challenge. But I have to say, I think the direction, I don't think we need to be under a state of emergency. I think what we need is the continued partnership that the state has with the local entities, with both the local governments, local boards of health, local Department of Health officials, because really you need, those are the experts on the ground, and then with the coordination with the state. I think that can happen and should happen without having this emergency proclamation over our heads. I think the frustration I've had has been not a good willingness on the part of the governor to really work with Republicans. That's going to be my partisan comment. I think that there is room now as we move through this to engage the legislature and to engage us more. Senator Billig talked about the education efforts and the efforts that were made. I know we can come together and do that, and we've done it on some things, on some of the proclamations, but the bigger system, our system isn't set up to have one person govern in an unlimited period of time. And so I think we can definitely continue to, make sure that people are safe, but more and more can be done, locally with the coordination with the state and with more of a role for the legislature. And so, it's a frustration, but I want to keep people safe. But I think we can do that, and we can get people back into work.
Senator Billig, if I could just amend the question slightly for you. Spokane County has been in phase 2 for a brief period of time. We have had some spikes in COVID occurrences. What can we be doing now to ensure that we're going to be able to stay in phase 2?
Yeah, I'll just briefly answer the sort of general state response, and then I definitely want to talk about that. Initially the stay-home order was the governor's early and decisive action. I think it was really helpful for us in Spokane and across the state to avoid a worse outbreak. I think that saved lives. I think it was really hard on the economy and somebody whose businesses, I won't say were shut down by the stay-home order were shut down by the pandemic and the stay-home order. I mean, even if there wasn't a stay-home order, I think people would be hesitant to go to large events. So I think those two things get conflated. But with that said, the one frustration I had representing Eastern Washington was I felt our voice wasn't heard as well as it should. And I was really glad to be part of a bipartisan local effort to present to the governor the idea of a regional variance and to not treat the whole state as the whole. Because I generally don't buy into the east-west divide, and the west side doesn't care about the east side, and the east side doesn't care about the west side. But in this case, I think we had to rattle the cage a little bit. And to the governor's credit, he said, okay, I understand, and changed. And the policy did change. And we were able to do that variance, not just for Spokane, but it helped counties all over the place. And so, I mean, that was a frustration, but also it had a solution. In terms of the legislative response, Senator Short mentioned what we did at the end of session, and that was really, truly a bipartisan. That was a great example of bipartisan work. I felt really fortunate to be able to take the lead for the Senate Democrats. Senator Schessler and Senator Braun were the lead for the Senate Republicans. We're working with the House members as well. And we put together that had Republican ideas all over it. And it had Democratic ideas all over it. And we passed it unanimously. We passed it in a fairly short amount of time. And it really was important for helping to support the response of the state. The other thing I want to just mention is we're also really focused now on long-term recovery. There's some short-term stuff, how do we open up and all of that, but we're really focused on long-term recovery. We've put together a first time, I think, ever, a special committee, it's called, on long-term economic recovery in the Senate, bipartisan committee. I actually was hoping Senator Short would be on that committee because we need an Eastern Washington person. We still got a spot potentially, Shelly. And I apologize for the background noise. My 5-year-old office mate is here. So we're really focused on that long-term recovery to make sure that this is a robust and sustained recovery for the long term, and to try to think outside the box. In terms of phase 2, so we're in phase 2 right now. It's sort of coincidentally, it wasn't because we went to phase 2, but we had an outbreak in Spokane, as probably everybody knows, right? Like as we were going to phase 2. Right. And, we have the ability to go to phase 3 within 3 weeks of going to phase 2. The parameter is actually looser to go now because we're further along in the process. The parameter is looser to get to phase 3 than it was to get to phase 2. But we just need to have 14 days of lower case counts. And the good news is today was 6 cases in Spokane County. Yesterday was 8 cases. If we can keep it in the single digits for 2 weeks, we'll be in phase 3. So, I mean, we have to apply it, but that's pretty much will meet the parameters. And then, one of the things, and I think early on we were ready earlier than we were ready for phase 2 earlier in Spokane than we got it. But it feels to me like if we could get to phase 3 in a few weeks, that phasing of what would be open would actually sort of match what people are ready for. Because like I said, we could have a baseball game right now, and I don't think people are coming. You could say bars are going to be open, and I think, maybe some of them would be packed, but I think a lot of the people would be nervous about that. And so as time goes on, people are going to be more comfortable going out to do things, and that should hopefully match the phasing. And that would be the best from a public health perspective as well, because that will then mean people are complying with the actual rules as public health has decided to do it. And that's, I guess, the last thing I'll say is just I've been with both the local officials I've worked with and the state officials. There's a real reliance on the science. And there is frustration with, as Senator Short said, with moving goalposts. Part of that is because the science changes. And if you're going to adhere to the facts and to the science, it means that you can't just establish a policy on March 13th and say, we're keeping that policy no matter what. I know mask wearing, for some reason, has become controversial. And people point to Tony Fauci said on March 8th, you don't need to wear masks out in public. And, 2 months later, he says, now I think you should wear a mask because we have more science that tells me that it is important. And that gets interpreted as, oh, this mask thing is a farce. Even the head person says we don't need to do it. But actually, if you're going to adhere to the science, That means you have to be ready to actually change your opinion and your stance according to the science. And so I think we've done that pretty well in Washington State. Not perfectly, but pretty well. And I hope we keep doing that.
All right, thank you very much.
And if I could follow up on that just a minute,
Sure.
because I've been looking at the chat too, and I think, you know, I'm not upset with Inslee because Inslee's a Democrat. You know, I'm you know, concerned about one person, you know, having complete unilateral control. The hardest thing that I have, and I'm sure Andy has too, is seeing the faces of the families, you know, who have loved ones in the hospital. Obviously, people who are, you know, their businesses are immediately shut down. The impacts of domestic violence, the impacts of, you know, kids trying to finish out their learning for the school year. It's not a partisan thing. It really isn't even, and I would say I misspoke in just saying, you know, my only partisan comment. It's really, I think all of those things could have happened without being under, you know, Governor Inslee or any governor. We have 50 governors statewide, and there's Republicans, Democrats doing the same thing. So it's not a party thing. But I think the one thing I'll tell you that has been a really good part, and Andy touched on it, was just the local health jurisdictions coming together with the people who need to make those decisions. They have an eye to how the impacts are in their communities. And so I know up here, Northeastern Washington, we've had the same thing. And a lot of times, you know, those who are elected are differing views than those who run the local departments of health. And there's tension there, as you might imagine, normally. And what I've seen is tremendous listening with one another to safely guide their communities through this pandemic. And I just think that's been a really positive thing, and has shown that I have faith that the local entities working with their, you know, with the people they're coordinating with, that we can get safely through this. We're going to have bumps along the way, but I think we could have done that without, you know, top-down control getting us there. And the, you know, the metrics, you know, a lot of times it's like, oh, California's doing this, or Oregon's doing this, or New York's doing this. So I absolutely believe that there are things that we will continue to learn about this virus and its impact on people. I think it feels kind of like the goalposts do get moved. I mean, I do need to share that. It's just, and Andy would expect I would. So it's just, as we go forward, we think more people ought to be at the table, not less.
All right, thanks. We're at an hour, but I do have one more question, and maybe briefly, it's kind of a large topic, unfortunately, but we've had civil unrest in our state last week, primarily in Seattle, and then yesterday, unfortunately, unexpectedly in my case, at least in Spokane. The underlying causes of that are, I think we all know, are stemming from George Floyd's death in Minneapolis while he was in custody of the Minneapolis police. Is there a role for the legislature to play in kind of addressing this situation in our state? And either one of you can take that.
Well, I think,
Yeah,
first. Oh, go ahead. Go ahead, Andy. I just think I want to say, for the record, that what happened was the most abominable thing I have ever seen. And to have, you know, my brother's retired law enforcement. He served with the city of Spokane. And that kind of treatment, to take a man's life in the way that happened, and for other law enforcement officers to stand by and let it happen, that is not reflective of our law enforcement community. I want to say that. We have people who protect everyone, regardless of the color of their skin and their ethnicity, and that the action that was taken is absolutely necessary to charge him, and I hope additional charges will be coming with the others.
Thank you. Senator Billig?
You know, while I was at the protest yesterday afternoon, and I was just, it was one of the most inspiring things I've been a part of. It was really heartwarming to see. There was over 5,000 peaceful protesters there, remembering George Floyd, making statements against racism, statements for police accountability, but doing it in a way that was just the way a protest should. Strong statements, but peaceful. The police during that protest, I thought, did an excellent job. They were respectful. They kept their distance. I actually didn't even see that many police because they were mostly at a distance. You know, that was a great thing. And I was down there probably a little over 2 hours. After that protest ended, there was a small number of people who then created a disturbance, which was absolutely sad to see and totally uncalled for and unacceptable. And, you know, whoever was responsible for that, whether that's anarchist or, you know, right-wing extremists or left-wing extremists or just opportunists who, those are not the people that were protesting, and certainly not the majority of the people that were protesting. And it's sad that the message was taken over and the news is dominated by the looting rather than the remembrance of George Floyd and the message about combating racism. The legislature, you know, the immediate work is really a local work. I think the legislature has done work. There's been work to change the statute to make it easier to convict a police officer. Washington had one of the highest bars, really insurmountable bar in terms of being able to convict a police officer of murder in the line of duty. And that bar was brought down just a little bit to be in line with other states, still a high bar. So that's one thing the legislature has done. And maybe there are other things that we can do as well in state law, but I'm not sure.
Thank you for those reflections, Senator. Go ahead, Senator.
I'd like to just add too, I do agree with Andy, the overshadowing of those who came in with the intent to harm really do overshadow the important message that the protesters who were there peacefully to share their concerns, to remember a man who was, whose life was taken. But I think we've got to start holding, and we'll learn more from local law enforcement, I think, about whether or not our laws are satisfactory to have people come into our community and ransack our businesses and make people fearful, especially when we just saw such an outpouring of appropriate, support for the family and for action, which is what our First Amendment is all about, the right of free speech and to gather and to peaceably protest. But we've also got to hold these other people accountable. And so whether or not our current laws allow that to happen, I mean, we will learn more, but I think we have got to be able to take action when people come in and, purposely demean and, injure either people or property.
Okay, thanks.
And Mark, could I just add one thing that I wanted to mention? I think it's going to answer one of the questions as well. I think and the question was about, will we be asking for video surveillance? And I've been in contact today with Chief Meidel from the Spokane Police Department and Sheriff Knezovich to ask about evidence of who was responsible. And so, yes, and also making sure that the police response was appropriate. I think we need to do both, and I think the police will welcome that as well, to be able to review the process and learn from it for future situations and make sure that we're holding people accountable across the map, from the law enforcement and to the perpetrators as well.
Thank you. Well, that's the formal questioning portion of the conversation. Before we take the audience questions, do either of you have anything else to add? Okay, doesn't look like it. Okay, I'm going to introduce Jenny Darrell. She is the president of PEG, and she's going to help with Q&A. And audience members, we encourage you to, if you have been waiting to submit a question to do so now. And Jenny, could you lead off, please? You're muted, Jenny.
It helps if I unmute. The senators have been graciously addressing questions as they came in, so I thank you for that. And I'm encouraging the audience to submit more. And in the meantime, I'll just say that Senator Billig, you've crushed my hopes for the summer. My season tickets are going to just kind of be on hold, I guess, for the Indians.
Thank you for being a season ticket holder. Yeah, we'll be back next year.
Absolutely. So, any questions from the audience?
I have one question I skipped,
Okay.
and it's about campaign finance reform. And we just had a question come up from one of our members. And Senator Billig, you've been a proponent of that. Where do we stand with your efforts or this in our state?
Yeah, no, I love that question. You know, we deal with like 20,000 different issues in the legislature, but we only know like 3 or 4 of them in depth. And that's, you know, just the reality of the situation. So you've got to rely on other people, you know, your experts at home and your staff experts and your colleagues on the other issues. I mentioned early learning, K-12 education, and then campaign finance reform and voting access is another area that I've spent a lot of time on with legislation in my legislative career. You know, we have probably the best or among the best campaign finance laws in the country here in Washington State. There were 2 initiatives passed by the people of Washington State, setting up the Public Disclosure Commission and really setting up the basis of our system. We have a very transparent system, and so that's the good part. You know, the hard part is that there's really smart people that run campaigns, and they can find ways to get around the rules. And so a lot of things that happen that you might not like as much are legal, but they really are exploiting loopholes in the system. And one loophole we closed a few years ago was to avoid identification. So I've spent a lot of time focused on, I've kind of given up on limits. We have limits, but the limits are hard to enforce, and the money kind of finds its way into the system. So the limits we have, you can donate $1,000 per election per candidate for a legislator or for a city council. Some cities have lower limits, but generally it's $1,000 limit. That's a good limit. Where we've really focused is on transparency. Because if you have transparency, then you have accountability. And even, this is not a left issue or a right issue. This is something that people agree on across the political bounds. Because if you can dive in, the media or an interested person can dive in through the Public Disclosure Commission and see who's responsible for an advertisement, or you can see at the bottom of the ad where it says top 5 donors are. What that does is to let people know the lens through which that advertisement is filtered. And it gives that voter so much better chance to be an informed voter. But it does something else too. When you have to put your name on it, you're less likely to really go deep into the mud. So it raises the level of discourse if you have to have your name on it. And we see this all the time. So people were finding out these ways around that where they would run money through a nonprofit group. So they give $10,000, the Association of, you know, air conditioning repair contractors, and then no disclosure except here's a donation from the Air Conditioner Repair Association. Well, if you knew that it was Joe's air conditioner repair, and Joe, who's the owner, is identified as the person who's running this really sleazy ad, they probably wouldn't run that ad. And in fact, we passed a bill to prevent that from happening called the Disclose Act. It passed 2 years ago. And one of the things that these associations said is, well, it's so much harder for us to get donations into our political committees where everything is disclosed. So we like running it through our association because people don't want their names associated with all the stuff we do. And I said, bingo, that's exactly why we're going to pass this law. So they have to be associated with it. So they have to meet their standard to have their name on it. And that is something we've made huge progress on. We have additional room to grow, but we've got a great system here in Washington State.
Thank you. Senator Short, your views?
the thing that I would advocate for too, and some of the reasons why at times I don't support legislation is because it's not the same for everyone. There are certain unions and things like that that don't necessarily get treated the same as other entities in the political process. So anything I look at, it has to be treated equally across the board. But like Andy said, we do get a lot of information on a lot of different things, and I continue to, to really review how these new laws are working and if they're doing what they said they're meant to do. I don't vote by who gives me money. I'm going to just say that straight up. I just don't, never have. It's about working with my colleagues to come up with policies that I either support because my district wants them supported. They're good for the state of Washington, or people have concerns with, and my votes reflect that. So most importantly, I still feel like I'm being true to the people in my district.
Thank you, Jenny. We've got a couple more questions in the chat box.
Yep, I have one here that a person says they are concerned about early learning educational requirements costing too much in time and money, so that early learning facilities would be short of staff and parents won't be able to find or afford childcare. Would either or both of you like to address that?
Sure.
Yeah, I'd be glad to take that.
Sure, go ahead, Andy, and I'll follow up.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, I mean, I think that there's a balance. So one of the reasons early learning, when it's high quality early learning makes sense, is because there's like multiple ways it pays off. If you've got a safe place to send your kids, and then you go to work, you're going to be a better worker. You're not going to have to miss work if it's unreliable childcare. You're not going to be worried about your kids with childcare. And so childcare makes sense for our workforce. So that's one reason that we have early learning. But that reason alone doesn't justify a large state investment. That's not a great return for the taxpayers to subsidize that system. There's a reason to subsidize. There's a reason for the state to be involved, but that doesn't. If you do that, what I just described, which is essentially childcare, and then you make it high quality programming, and this is programming that's been studied and reviewed to know that it pays off, that actually you're doing things that will change the trajectory of that child's life. And this is particularly for low-income kids. If you do that, and you know that that result is going to actually help with graduation rates and better health outcomes and less chance to be in prison and higher returns as a taxpayer when that child grows up, then it's a really good investment for taxpayers. So I think that, and so a lot of the requirements that sometimes go overboard, and we have to make sure that we have the right balance, but a lot of those requirements are the things that make it high quality. There is so much evidence to show that an educated early learning teacher that has a certain level of degree gets a better result for that kid that will be long lasting through the rest of their life. So we've got to be careful and not just snap our fingers and say every early learning teacher has to have a bachelor's degree, but it is smart to put ourselves on a path to that and make sure we're paying them appropriately to do that. So I really look at it as, I want to help the kids, I want to help the parents. I also want it to be a decent return for the taxpayers, but it's only a good return for the taxpayers if it's high quality, and some of these regulations are required to make it high quality.
Senator Short?
So that's where the good gentleman and I are going to slightly disagree a little bit. Not about the need for educated, an educated workforce to be, giving the best to our kids. I think the frustration I've had with this issue, with my start in the legislature, is that, government kind of knows best. And we have, my kids were in daycare when they were younger, and our families are close to this day. When you make it to the point where we don't have good in-home daycares or choices for families and parents, I think the regulations, when Betty Hyde was the director of Department of Early Learning, and I understand that the two are put together, with DCYF, it just seemed like a lot of the regulations that were there didn't really add safety they didn't really add to the education of the child. They were really meant to just control the daycare operations. To the point, I mean, I don't disagree with Andy that we want a good investment. We've got amazing daycare centers. But when we say it's a one size fits all, or because you're an in-home daycare, or maybe you don't have the newest technology, or maybe your building's a little older, you know, those things should not be seen as a disincentive, or make it seem as though there's less of an education going on in those, you know, in those places. I talk to a lot of daycare owners and operators who absolutely love these kids. They want the kids to succeed. They want to give them, you know, they want to create a good environment for them. But I do think it has gotten out of control. And again, you're assuming that a person with a degree has a better chance of educating a young person, when maybe what that young person needs is someone who's paying attention to them, who is teaching them at a level they can learn. And oftentimes that can be, you know, done by a grandma who loves taking care of kids, and it doesn't have to be in a formal setting. We can have all of those things, but unfortunately all of the regulations are the same regardless. And so I get concerned. I want our kids to be safe. I want them learning, but I also want parents to have choice. And a lot of times the parents know, you know, where their children flourish. Mine were in an in-home daycare center that they unbelievably flourished. And so I get a little concerned sometimes that the achievements end up kind of being a detriment almost, you know, depending on how they're implemented and how they're regulated. We'll see how it goes.
Certainly, go ahead.
Mark, yeah, I just wanted to add one thing, because I agree, you know, we on regulations, not just with childcare facilities, but across on all regulations, we have to make sure they have to make sense. You know, like they got to pass the common sense test, and sometimes they don't. And we've had, actually, this is an area we've worked bipartisan. I've worked with Representative McCaslin and Representative Dent, who are two Republicans that I've worked closely with them on that. And I remember one example, there was like the requirements for the child care center had a different requirement for the size of a window than the local building code did. Okay, that doesn't make sense. We passed a law that said that you can't have a child care requirement that's different than the local building code. Okay, so there are things that are off, and we always have to be watching for that. It's a great role legislators can play, because people in daycare or any other business can contact their legislator and say, hey, this doesn't make sense to me. Can you explain it to me, or can you help me change it? But I do want to make a distinction, because I agree, should let that grandma who wants to be an in-home child care should be able to do that with, you know, with appropriate safety. You know, I think licensing has a place so that there's appropriate safety licensing. But we should have a different standard when the state is going to subsidize those kids to go, because we should protect that state investment to make sure that we're getting that extra return to really help those kids to change their lives. And we know that works. And so I think that, and we do in our state, we can differentiate a little bit better between a child care provider that's just providing that choice and maybe doesn't have all of the same requirements as this other provider that's actually doing it with taxpayer dollars.
Thank you. Jenny, how's the chat box looking?
I've got a couple of questions that are related to ranked choice voting, so if we can kind of return to that issue. One is that perhaps ranked choice voting could encourage the disenfranchised to re-engage with the political process. That's one point. And then the next question is related to the costs of campaigns. They're expensive, they're exhausting. Couldn't ranked choice voting shorten the cycle, since it would be possible to get rid of the primaries and also give third parties a shot at least? So would you like to address those two?
Sure, I'd be glad to. I think those are two great points, and that they make sense to me. Like those could be reasons to do it, to energize people who feel turned off by the system, or to shorten up the campaign time frame. So anyway, and it goes back to what I had originally said. Like, I'd like to try it. I'd like to try it on some local elections and see what those results are. Does the participation go up? What does it do to the cost of campaign? And then once we have that information, and then be able to roll it out statewide, and who knows, maybe nationally.
It'll be interesting to see if something like that would actually change the construct of participation and the cost. I want to just share with folks that we've done work over, especially most recently, where you're getting voter boxes and things like that into areas that traditionally haven't had them, so they're not having to go to the courthouse to turn their ballots in to participate. There was legislation that actually, for individuals who might not have a home address, that there are areas that these individuals could go to participate, all with the eye of doing exactly that, which is increasing participation. I'm not sure if the expense of the campaign is going to change, only because even if you take out the primary, generally, you're filing for office in May, and so your campaign season doesn't really change. You're still gonna, I think the cost piece might not bear out like folks are thinking, but we'll see if it does or not. And there was another question with the top two primary. Honestly, our prior system was found unconstitutional. So I think the top two primary is what came into being as a result of our longstanding system being declared unconstitutional. Whether we look to do anything beyond it, it is what we have.
I have a question for both of you. I'm a retired Air Force member, and I voted absentee for 20 years as a resident of the state of South Dakota. Came to Washington when I retired. I was stationed at Fairchild at one point, and had to do mail-in balloting. And it made sense to me. I'd done it nearly my whole adult life. It's controversial right now, I think, for political purposes. What are your thoughts about our state's mail-in balloting process, Senator Billig?
So we have a long history of success with mail-in ballots. There has never been any widespread fraud. There's never been fraud more than a vote or two here or there. Many other states have similar experiences. Our Republican Secretary of State has said that. Our Democratic governor has said that. So it's not a partisan issue here. And in a lot of ways, all mail votes are better because they increase the ability for people to access the election. It doesn't make it harder when it rains to go vote. It doesn't make it hard on disabled people to go vote or elderly to go vote. You can take your time over 3 weeks. You can do your research. So I think you get better informed voters than sitting in a voting booth and going, what was that? What was this race? I can't remember. You can sit there and do that. So I think it has a lot of advantages that way. And then lastly, in terms of security, mail-in voting is particularly good because there's a paper trail. You have an actual paper ballot. And whether you vote in person or vote by mail, the most secure systems have a paper ballot. And so every mail-in system has a paper ballot. And there's no reason for anybody to talk about a mail-in system being less secure.
Senator Short?
So we actually have done a lot in our state to clean up issues that have happened in the past, where boxes of ballots have been found in King County and one Dino Rossi, Governor Gregoire race. But the fact is we have changed that a great deal, and we have worked to bring about a system that is actually very robust, and it, our county auditors do a tremendous job. And when you think of the follow-up, people can actually go and witness ballots being counted in all of our counties, so they can witness this firsthand. I feel, I'm confident in what we've done in Washington State. And I think a lot of changes have been put in place to make sure there aren't duplicate ballots, to make sure people who are deceased are taken off the voter rolls and so forth. So I'm proud of all of the efforts that have been done. I think when you think about it in a nationwide sense, to me, are each state, are they in the same position that we are to hold the kind of, to have the necessary protections in place. And I think when you think about 50 individual states doing that, I know what Washington State does, and I'm proud of it. I don't know what other states do. And so I think that may be where some of the challenges are of doing it as a nationwide perspective. But I feel we have, and will continue to make sure that we have a good, robust, protected system for people to vote.
Thanks. We've just got a couple minutes left. Going back to the first question I asked you, I'd like you to each of you name the person who inspires you or has inspired you in the past to work in a bipartisan manner, whether somebody currently or somebody from our political history. Senator Short?
Well, I have to, first of all, I have to say my dad. And I know he's not a political figure. He was not alive to see me do what I'm doing today, but I learned a lot from him. I learned how to be a good listener and to really pay attention to what people are saying and to figure a way, he did things through partnerships in all the things he did in his life. But, from a political perspective, he's a Republican. That doesn't mean anything other than, when I saw George Nethercutt, I had the opportunity to work for him. And the thing that he impressed upon me is the ability to work with people and to listen and to take their views and just treat people with respect and to always be looking for how can I take that piece of information and make it count for that person or that group. And I'll tell you, I was in my early 30s when I started on that adventure with him, and he was a tremendous mentor. He showed how it really should be done. I'm sure there are times that the good senator would disagree maybe on a policy, but for him as a person and how he treated people, I learned a tremendous amount from him at what I feel was an impressionable time in my life, to make sure that we do things the right way.
Thank you. And great answer on your father, by the way, I think. Senator Billig.
I feel I have an answer two ways. One, I feel really guided in bipartisanship by my relationships throughout my family, but really throughout our community here with Republicans and Democrats. And so it's easy when I think about an issue to be thinking about how would, my partner in the Spokane Indians, who's a Republican, think about this? How would my next door neighbor, who's a really strong Democrat, who's the left of me, how would they think about this? There are certain key people that I spend time with who I really respect and who have very diverse political views. And I think about it through their lens. What would they say? And then I did want to mention, if you want to talk about political figures, it was really valuable. So that I get to be the majority leader now, and I feel really fortunate about, really lucky to have that job. And I think everybody that has that job should have always spent time in the minority, because it is a very different experience to be in the minority or the majority. If I had just stayed in the House, I spent 2 years in the House, I had just stayed in the House, I probably would have been in the majority the whole time. And I wouldn't have ever had that perspective. Now, 5 years, I didn't even spend 5 years in the minority. It's frustrating. But it is an experience that you get to see that bipartisanship from a different angle and a really important angle. And you mentioned Bruce Stanmeyer, and he was somebody I worked so closely with when the Republicans were in the majority and we were working together on education stuff. And he and I disagreed often on things, but I really felt like he always sought out my opinion. And then sometimes he could incorporate my opinion, and sometimes he couldn't incorporate my opinion. But I've remembered that and always tried to do that as a legislator, but also as a majority leader, to make sure that we have the opinions, even if they don't pass, that we have the opinions, diverse opinions that are incorporated there. Because, as I think Senator Short said, it's important to hear that opinion. And then it also, in some cases, is important to include that opinion and that opinion does make the legislation better in the end.
Thank you for that answer, Senator Short. Senator Billig, I want to thank you for joining us today. And Ginny, do you have any parting thoughts for us?
Well, I want to thank the audience members for joining us as well and for participating with the questions, and encourage all of you to please look at our website, www.pegnow.org, and consider joining. We would love to have you as members. Thank you all.
Thanks
Thank you
again,
so
Senator.
Thank you so much.
All right.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye.